Hello and welcome to the Claw Studio at the Royal Opera House and to this insight, which is part of this year's Engender Festival. I'm Lisa Peck and I research feminist practices in performance making. And tonight's insight explores The Blue Woman, a new opera by Laura Lomas and Laura Lomas. This insight will be discussing material that some viewers may find upsetting, and so discretion is advised. The Blue Woman explores the psychological aftermath of sexual violence on women. It excavates the interior landscape of one woman who has experienced a post-traumatic shattering of self as a consequence of being raped. Exploring themes of trauma and community, The Blue Woman provokes a conversation between how opera deals with violence against women and our modern-day understanding of that reality. Katie Mitchell's production, which opens here at the Royal Opera House on the 6th of July, is at the heart of this year's Engender Festival, which celebrates the work of women and non-binary people in opera. Engender is the Royal Opera's initiative to deliver transformational change in gender representation and to drive gender equality in all areas of the opera sector, both on stage and behind the scenes. As part of the festival, in this evening's insight, we'll meet the makers of this important new work to find out more about the process of bringing this piece to the stage. So tonight, I'm joined with the creative team behind The Blue Woman. Director Katie Mitchell, soprano Gweneth Ann Rand, composer Laura Lomas, and librettist Laura Lomas. Please welcome them. So, thank you so much for making the time when you're all so busy preparing for opening night. I'd just like to start to open the conversation really with some of the thinking behind this piece of work. And just to start off with the title. So I wonder, Laura, if you could just talk to why the Blue Woman? Where does this symbolism come from?
Yeah, so I was interested in the way that trauma can sort of reframe the world, or in the aftermath of trauma, the world is reframed. And so the Blue Woman, the idea particularly about, sort of specifically, I was interested in the way that the, sorry, I kind of lost my words a little bit.
It's so striking, that colour in the title. And having seen the dress rehearsal this afternoon, it seems to me that synesthesia and this idea of colour and the senses is a really important part of your writing. Yeah.
So it's about the way that sort of an experience can bleed into everything that so one woman's experience of sexual violence bleeds into everything that she does. And so I was interested in the idea that the colour, that could be an actual colour, so if that was blue. So everything that she experiences is kind of coloured by the experience of her sexual assault. So that was kind of the idea about the Blue Woman. So everything is sort of coloured by that, and that kind of frame or that kind of lens and way of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm. And we were talking, weren't we, before about Maggie Nelson's book, Bluets, which is someone who, and the difference there, this is a book about someone who is obsessed with the colour blue and all things blue. And you were saying, which I thought was really useful, that the difference between the two was that was someone's love of the colour blue, whereas in this case, this woman is sort of overshadowed by the colour blue and permeated by the colour blue as well.
Thank you. Why did you decide to come together at this particular moment? Well, I actually don't know how long you've been working on this piece.
2.5 years?
Yeah,
3 years?
2.5 years.
Okay.
Well, it's Laura Lomas that sort of initiated the journey. And because you've always been really interested in the representation of women and sexual violence in planet opera, as I call it, and the canon. And I think you did a workshop at Aldeburgh, didn't you?
Yes, so I've always been interested in that as someone who has always made opera but also always witnessed opera, and I had many feelings about that. So I decided to address those feelings creatively. And I was lucky enough that Britain Peers offered me a residency to explore how I might make a work that is in some way in dialogue with those works across the canon. And I spent some time workshopping there, and I kind of wasn't sure about which direction I wanted to go in, how it was going to manifest. And so I was lucky enough to go on Katie's Women Opera Makers course in Aix-en-Provence. And I started a conversation with Katie about it and said, I'm thinking about making this project. I'm not really sure how it's going to manifest. What do you think? And Katie was very interested. And
well, I cracked a joke. You should have asked me to direct it or something like that.
Yes.
You then.
Yes. So Katie said, well, you should have asked me to direct it. And I thought, well, I never would have thought of that Katie might actually direct it. But then I asked her and she said yes. So, and then Katie then introduced me to Laura.
Yeah.
And then we started kind of a group dialogue about how this work might develop from that point between the three of us.
Yeah.
But it takes a long time. I think when people reflect on how an opera is made, because it was like several months, wasn't it? Proper, really thoughtful research. Mm-hmm. And then you went off to write the libretto on and off over a period of a year, was that right?
I think it was about that, yeah.
And then you did 6 months solid composing. So it's overall, it's sort of like, I think about 2 years. It's quite, and then, lovely Gwen, you joined much later in the process, right towards the end, or you could say the beginning.
And you know, just strikes me that over these did you say 2.5 years working from the beginning of the German?
I mean, COVID slowed it down a bit.
Yeah. But, you know, obviously what's happened to the world in the last 2.5 years, and particularly in terms of the position of women, you know, I'm thinking about recent events that are challenging women's rights. I'm thinking about increased sexual violence in home, on the streets. Mm-hmm. You know, how did you feel during this process as you were responding to these kind of seismic shifts that were happening around you?
Fucking angry.
Mm. Yeah, I bet.
I think that's what I felt, but I can't speak for my colleagues.
Yes, I think rage is a good word. Rage, but also some sense of sorrow as well. I think it makes it a tumultuous journey as a creative, I think, working in the environment that you are addressing directly. Yes. So.
But I think, in a way, the historical events sort of, I think, expanded the scope of the piece of work in one sense. So as opposed to it being about an individual experience, although there is a spine of an individual experience, I think we began to expand it into a much more collective picture.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I was quite interested in the idea of many sort of experience, so it doesn't just become like a singular subjective experience of one woman, it's speaking to a larger collective experience. But in terms of sort of, you know, the kind of recent media and things around it, I think what I felt was like we're living inside this all the time anyway. We're maybe having a more public conversation than we've had before, but actually the libretto was written sort of much before many of these kind of recent events of horrific violence against women was sort of happened, but actually the fact that it sort of speaks to them is because we're always living inside this violence, and yeah, very much the kind of the need to articulate a rage around that felt really important.
And it seems so vitally important at this moment, and the way that it's speaking to the canon of opera. I think is really important to just spend some time on. So thinking about how sexual violence is represented in the canon of both original material and indeed in contemporary productions, I wonder if, Gweneth, you would mind talking to that from your experience?
Well, it's obviously handled differently. I think more importantly, it depends on the gaze of the people that are creating the work. For example, we have a completely female crew, female production, all females on stage, female cellists, an amazing percussionist, a female conductor, but it means that the way that everything has been approached has been from a female perspective, obviously. It's not where you could have maybe an opera like Tosca, where there is some violence within it. You would have normally, well, apart from you, a male director then dealing with it. It would be from very much a male perspective. So there's a delicacy, a different finessing, a different conversation that's had, and a different attitude, generally, when you talk about regular canon with a female director and a more interesting, new canon work.
Mm-hmm.
Hopefully this will become part of new work, as part of a new canon with different ideals and a different way, a different perspective. That's what it gives you. And it also makes you feel safer.
Okay.
There's more that you can risk within an environment like this than you can in regular canon, I think.
Yeah. I mean, in terms of the canon, maybe Laura, you'd like to just, I'm not asking for a comprehensive overview of the canon at this point, but in terms of considering sexual representation and how that is often dealt with in even contemporary productions, would you like to speak to that?
Well, I think, as Gwen just touched on, there's two different factors. There's the operas themselves, as they were written, and then there are the interpretations by directors. And so in some cases, there are operas that are written that don't have any sexual violence in, but then male directors choose to put sexual violence in the production. I'm just going to leave it open as to why someone would do that rather than trying to figure that out myself. And then obviously the works in the canon which are wholly written by men, male composers, and quite often male librettists, which tell stories or have scenes in which sexual violence is committed to women or other forms of violence to women. And inevitably, it's through the male gaze, as Gwen talked about, but also it's in dialogue with the context in which the works were written as well. Perspectives and dialogue around this has changed vastly. And I think as an art form, we have a great responsibility to address that problem in the canon, for directors to be fully aware of the problematic content and to find ways, different angles, different perspectives around that in order to be able to present the canon in a way that is looking through a contemporary lens and also a way that, engages with the female perspective.
Because it's like, isn't it, that if you pull something, a historical artifact through time, it's like you pull through time all the beautiful leaves and branches of the music, but you're also pulling the sort of toxicity of the original gender politics. And then if you just replant it in the modern day and you don't address the gender politics, you end up condoning them and licensing misogyny. So it's got to be tackled because it's a sort of urgent political need.
Yeah, absolutely. And how would you say that you have tried to tackle that in this work? Maybe we start on you, Laura.
I think for me, a big thing was about making the political decision not to represent violence like inside the librettist, and there not to be a description of the violence, or for there not to be a scene of rape in the libretto, because it felt like in recreating it, it feels like that's quite a dehumanising sort of event, and that could possibly be fetishizing the event, and perhaps that's what historically kind of the canon has had a problem with. So I was much more interested in sort of dramatising the psychological effects on a woman or on women of the violence, which felt to me politically kind of like a humanising. It's like inviting the audience to deeply, deeply empathise with women, as opposed to sort of the gaze of kind of the violence or rewatching the violence.
And it's something fundamentally not theatrical about that idea. Because you're looking at a very, very slow, delicate, tender process of sort of realignment after trauma. And so in the same way that you wrote that in that way in the libretto. When it came to sort of directing it, we were just looking at the tiny, tiny details of very sort of banal moments of, shall I take an antidepressant or not? Just catching reflection on a tube train. And so it's sort of consciously anti-theatrical, wouldn't you say?
Yeah.
That both the original libretto, but also the staging.
Yeah.
But I wonder how it feels for you, Gwen, on the inside of those tiny, tiny naturalistic details of...
It's hyper-realistic.
Yeah.
It almost makes it more concentrated in that moment. And that in that way, it makes the emotion purer and the reaction purer. And I think that's what's really important. We're dealing with realism in opera, as real as it can be. Someone has a reaction to something or is triggered by something. It's not melodramatically done. It's done in a human response manner, which makes it so much more pertinent, and then it makes it easily communicated. People understand the emotion of it. People have felt it. People have known people that have experienced it. And that's how you then make that message reach so many more people, I think.
But then do you remember when we were talking about the feeling of what happens? And I was talking about my theatre work and being very interested in not communicating the events themselves, but the feeling of the event. And I was saying what's remarkable about Laura Bola's music is that she gives the feeling of the aftermath of rape. And in the music, really, really deep in it. And I think you were talking about how visceral that is. It's an amazing sort of like musical journey, isn't it?
Totally. And having seen it this afternoon, I think this opera does something to your body. You know, it really does make you feel the impossibility, actually, of staging trauma. And it, I think, kind of captures that through the senses in so many different ways, with so much layering, that, you know, rather than being told a story, you're given a transformatory experience through your body, which I think is incredibly special. So we're going to, a bit later on, talk about this way that the form of the opera itself responds to this subject matter, because I think that's really fascinating. But I wonder if we could just think for a second about the ethical responsibilities of staging trauma. And I'd be really interested in your reflections on how you have worked through some of those ethical responsibilities from your position as creatives, and what you imagine this might pose for audiences in terms of thinking about their ethical responsibility as witnesses of trauma. Would anybody like to jump off that?
I think I'm going to answer it. I suppose that's a sort of, there are lots of layers. So the first layer would be making sure that we set up a sort of working environment that is very sort of safe and supportive in case anyone were to be triggered as part of the process of making the show, which we were very, together with the management of the Royal Opera House, very clear that we wanted to do. So we have some therapeutic support in place. And then I suppose the second thing is probably in the performing of it. We are trying to stay on very, very tiny, banal details in a way. So there's trying to not reduce the possibility of being triggered, because sadly that can't be achieved, although we hope it doesn't happen. But to try and do very, very tiny things as opposed to big, noisy, loud, male things.
Yeah. That's interesting. Can you give me an example, maybe, Gweneth, of these tiny details?
Okay. Essentially, everything is a human response, but it's almost a cinematic human response. So when you talk about regular canon, you know, I'm not taking the Michael, just want that known. You know, if I'm sad, I'm sad. No, it's you're actually sad in that moment. And it's not a huge movement. You might just, you know, change your body or you'll sigh. But it's the human responses that Katie's put into everything. You know, if you catch yourself looking at a reflection, but you don't know if it's quite you, you just look at it. It's not a huge thing, but everything registers. And because it's such naturalistic movement, it then is as real as it can be. That's why I call it hyperrealism. Does that make sense?
I think it's right, but maybe it's intending to be respectful of the experience, the real experience, the lived experience of the possibility of people having that lived experience in the audience. So being really as thoughtful as possible about that.
It's basically care, more than anything else. It's care. It's care for an audience. It's care for the people that are creating the piece. It's a general level of care that sometimes isn't affected in canon. So thank you for that.
Totally my pleasure. I've got my wonderful colleagues, got you.
Have you also worked in this careful way on the detail of the composition? Has it felt different at all?
It has felt very different, yes. I probably wouldn't ever describe my process as careful as a composer, which is probably apparent in my work. But yes, it was a very different process because of the responsibility, essentially. And to the point that there were many times throughout the process when I was sitting there and kind of going, how, you know, even with the text in this, which is, you know, beautiful, very poetic and isn't, you know, doesn't describe, doesn't specifically articulate the act, there were still moments when I was very conscious of what does it mean to set this? What does it mean for this to be sung? Should it be sung?
But you also gave box loads of books, didn't you?
Yes.
You did so much reading. That's the other thing to say, which went then to Laura Lomas, didn't they?
Yeah, exactly. And I think that there was something for me as well in just to say a bit more about that, the need to kind of articulate a collective experience, because it's like how do you write about rape? That was like kind of the proposition that I was sort of given. And for me, it felt like really political for it not to just be like a singular subjective experience. And I was thinking about all the different contexts that women experience violence. And so the idea for me came up with this sort of notion of having like loops of time that are kind of refracted through the libretto of different women in different places. And for me, that kind of, it sort of speaks to that question of what are the ethical responsibilities of representing an experience as big as this, is that can there be a way within the form of the opera that you're able to shatter through many different experiences? So yeah, that felt quite important kind of as a formal decision for me.
Yeah, there was quite a funny moment which Katie mentioned where I did kind of post my box full of 40 odd books on the subject matter across from Macclesfield to London to Laura.
Massive box.
So,
Yeah,
yes,
exactly.
I think maybe you might still have
I've
the box.
still got it. Yeah, it's massive.
They've got to come back to Macclesfield.
And did those books change your direction?
I think that they sort of fed into, so I used to, many years ago, volunteer for Rape Crisis as well, so they kind of fed into sort of like knowledge and like that I already had, but it felt really important to sort of ground it in research as well, like very much so, yeah, and that was a really, really sort of important thing, yeah.
And am I right in thinking, Laura, that verbatim, there were verbatim testimony as part of your writing process?
It's not, no, not in the libretto, no.
Okay. But this, I mean, maybe I'm thinking about the chorus. Maybe we could just stick with the chorus for a second. This idea of a collective responsibility, a kind of caregiving. And what was striking for me was seeing both musicians and performers on stage together, and a real sense of that kind of collective sharing. How was that there right from the beginning of the idea in the form of this work?
Well, the thing is that Laura Bowler's quite a strict musician. Yeah. So right from the outset, you know, there was a lot of thoughtful reading, but there were some really tough musical parameters. So I want 4 soloists, 4 cellists, percussion. So you were very strong about your musical parameters, weren't you?
Yeah, so I came with the musical parameters to Laura, so
here it is.
I can work within that. No, it was very important to me to have the cellists on stage, for instance, and to have them as also essentially fracturings of the female psyche in the same way that the 4 vocalists are in the work. And so I came with that to Laura, and then Laura kind of took that form.
But then she passed it to me, and that's like a nightmare, because basically if you've got like cellist performer, there's no space for much action as well. So that really reduced it, because the actual process of playing the cello is quite a wide process, isn't it? So that helps sort of like funnel, if you like, the concept for the staging.
Okay, it's fascinating. I mean, thinking about this process that you've moved through, what would you say has been particularly different or interesting, or particular about this process?
Wow.
Anyone?
Oh, don't look at me.
We've said a little bit about that. Of course, having a kind of predominantly all-female, was it literally an all-female creative team?
Now that's been really, really joyful. I mean, I feel my pleasure from it as a senior female artist who've been sort of like struggling with the canon for many years. It's just been a huge privilege to work with the younger generation of both writer and composer. That's been fantastic. Sort of come in a sort of like caretaking way. And the work of both Lauras is just exceptional. So that's been really, really thrilling for me.
I was just thinking that one of the big differences for me, which I hadn't really reflected on, it's very practical, is the amount of rehearsal. That's very unusual. Like normally, you know, I might get 2 days rehearsal for a project, a performance with an orchestra, or, you know, maybe a song cycle, or it's very, very limited. So to have this time to sit with the work, with the performers and with the other creatives is very special. And I've just in that moment realised that, that I've kind of...
What does that time bring you?
I think, one, it brings the possibility of building stronger relationships throughout the process with everyone involved, but also it enables you to have a continually critical reflection on the work as an artist, which literally there isn't time for in most circumstances. So that's a wonderful privilege.
Yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
How about you, Laura?
I think for me, so I'm not from an opera background. This is the first libretto I've written. I'm sort of a playwright, sort of firstly, and I write screen as well. So I think for me that it's been a very different process just in terms of writing something that has to be, well, that is so economic and very precise. But also I'd say, like, in terms of our collaboration, that's perhaps been a different process, hasn't it? Like, 'cause normally I would like write a play and then like show it somewhere, but I feel like there's been a really sort of deep collaboration between me and Laura, like in terms of sharing research, in terms of having conversations, in terms of like when I was writing the libretto, like sending sections of things and being like, I'm not even sure how this is organised yet, but like, what do you think of this? And I think sort of perhaps the same, like...
To say it the other way, it's very embarrassing, they will never go public, but there are recordings of me done on my phone, sending bits to Laura and Katie in the opera game.
Sort
What
of
do you think
like,
of this?
You'd just be on the bus and you'd get like a sort of Laura singing
Voice note.
on a WhatsApp and voice note.
Not having I'm also from theatre making background. I'm really intrigued in this passing between that happens between libretto and composer. I mean, is that normal that it's passed between?
In terms of the text, I don't know.
I mean, I think it depends on the relationship, but certainly I think there must, you know, I would assume that there is a back and forth between two artists who are working so closely together, and it felt essential for this project to have that other perspective and, you know, multiple kind of eyes on the project.
Yeah. How about you, Gweneth? In terms of this process, I'm wondering whether or not the material, we'll talk a little bit more specifically about the challenges of the material in a minute, but I'm wondering whether or not the material and all of these layers in this piece, how you've met that challenge.
Did I say oh?
Well, or is that a challenge? Maybe that's, that's just a total joy.
It's so a challenge.
Okay.
for so many reasons. The way that it's been written is through composed, which means that sometimes it's very difficult to hang on to things. For us, well, for me personally, it definitely made it a challenge, but we have layerings of electronics as well, plus the cello, plus the percussion, and everything was used as percussion, trust me. It was we had to build those layers in, and each time a new layer came in, you had 4 singers that were like, what is going on? You know, it was a case of reacclimatizing every single time. And then when we finally had everything together, you were like, oh, I get it now. Oh, it makes sense. Every layer had a different language. And it was a case of putting all those languages together to create the whole. And that's what made it really interesting, I think.
But it's really a headfuck, isn't it? Because your live singing is live mixed and processed during the show. It's not just that there's new electronic tracks as well. It's just so multi-layered.
There's a part in the show where 4 of us are murmuring. Each layer of that murmuring is then looped on itself while we are still murmuring new stuff. So you have no idea where you are most of the time. Thank goodness that we had Jamie doing this, because otherwise you were just like, the first time we did it, you just saw 4 people going, I have no idea what's going on. But you build into it. It was definitely a challenge, but that's the fun of it. You get to create something that hasn't been created before, that hasn't been thought of before, and that's exciting.
I mean, I'm wondering, I'd like to talk about the form, because we've kind of hinted at it, but I'd really like to dig in to all of the decisions that have been made in terms of the formal structure and how this is reflective of the subject matter. Because it struck me as I was watching it this afternoon, you know, is this a start of a feminist canon in opera? And if there is going to be a feminist canon in opera, then what are the materials that would define that? So I'd be really interested in terms of you breaking it down in terms of the structure, the writing, the dramaturgy, the staging, the performance.
Pointed to me, wow. Wow, okay. So I'm just going to talk about the form of Blue Woman from my perspective.
Yeah.
And see if that takes us
brilliant.
somewhere,
Yeah.
I think. So obviously written into the form that Laura's already described is this fracturing, which is a representation of the female psyche post-trauma. And inevitably with that becomes a fracturing of the musical form as well. So the structure, I suppose, in some ways is quite unusual in that sense. It's quite unconventional in the sense that we are quite literally taken on the fractured journey structurally of our 4 protagonists, so to speak. And in that, I found myself as a composer struggling with that, because, you know, I have my set ways of approaching form, and this really challenged that. It, like, you know, head on was like, no, that won't work for this piece. So I found myself kind of constantly thinking about how I can navigate that actually incredibly complex form and how that might manifest. And then I found myself, there's a scene in it which actually has the least text in, but it's actually the longest scene. And there's a very pertinent, strong reason for that, is that I kind of got to that point in the opera and the structure is incredibly fractured. It's very dynamic in terms of the experience that we go on emotionally, musically, text-wise as well. And then I got to this scene, and this scene, at this point in what it evokes emotionally, it felt very much like we needed to sit in it for the longest period, despite the length of the text, and that it was really important for us to, as creators and listeners, to have that moment to really embed ourselves in one particular language for a long time. And then, I won't tell you anything about scene 8. But yeah, so it was a very interesting process for me structurally.
Yeah, I think for me there is something about trying to capture, like really deeply, the kind of the emotional sort of experience. And I think within the kind of form of it, there is a rejection of perhaps something that is more like linear in terms of a narrative. So I'm just thinking about that scene. It's like sometimes I feel it all.
Yeah.
And then there's a scene where kind of different sort of sections that we've heard previously, like different loops of experience and of time, kind of all start kind of coalescing and vibrating together. And if I'd have tried, what I was trying to do in that, so just for an example of that particular scene, was just to sort of capture that sense of something being so overwhelming and the experience of feeling everything vibrating at once. And I think if you tried to sort of distill that into like a singular narrative line, it just wouldn't work. So I think there's probably something that is maybe could you say inherently female, or about the experience of trying to formally capture an emotional experience in sort of text and music. So it's sort of, there's a rejection of perhaps like an older form of storytelling that maybe is perhaps more historically patriarchal.
Mm-hmm. It's more like cubism than naturalism, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah, okay, yeah.
Mm. And that cubism, how did you bring your staging to these decisions that these artists were making?
Well, it is so hard musically to sing and to play that most of the energy during the process working with Lizzie Clacken, the set designer, was to create a sort of sound box so that everything could work beautifully. So I think you were keen that it went cellist, performer, cellist, performer, cellist, performer, cellist, performer. So we then thought, well, that's the whole stage filled up with not much options. They're going to have to be in those fixed positions. And then I realised that the main effort and the main gesture was going to be the singing, and the instrumental music was so hard and so complex. So we spent a lot of time working on creating a very porous sound-sealed box so that it didn't deafen the people inside the box, because everyone's mic'd, both the cellists and also the singers. And then I thought it might be a good idea to have a film running at the same time to make things just like even more complex, so that following that idea of the sort of fragmented experience and the collective experience, we could have many, many layers, if you like, of female experience. So in the end, it's a long blue box, cellist, singer, cellist, singer, cellist. And as Gwen said, they're doing very, very detailed, tiny, naturalistic work, very thoughtful, very deep. And then above, there is an actor who is also travelling through the city, different places in the city of London. That goes on simultaneously. But I've never worked on a piece where the music determines and defines the concept and the scenography so strongly. We had more conversations with the sound designer and technician that you work with than anyone else.
And sound actually also has many different materials in the work. So it's not just the cello and the singing voice. There's lots of different types of sound and lots of different use of the voice as well in this work. Gweneth, could you talk to that?
It's hard. It's a very difficult piece to absorb. Normally with, I'm going to say, traditional canon, you have keys, you can pretty much formulate what's going to happen next. It makes it a much easier process to learn. This was not. It was both challenging. At some points, there was a little bit of hysteria, but it's totally understandable. And the layering of, as I said before, I've worked with electronics and chamber orchestras. I've never worked in a formation where, due to the way that the stage has been set out for the performers, you're working almost in a musical vacuum. You can hear everything and nothing at the same time, which means that it creates more complications again. And if anyone is at a level that is higher than they should be, which you found out during the process of trying to work out all the audio stuff, it then threw everything off. So it's been a very delicate balance, generally.
There are speakers above all of you as well, so that when there are certain sort of duets or quartets, then the speakers above each of you have to be set at certain levels so that you can hear someone on the other side of the stage sing, so that you can know when to come in.
That makes it sound so simple.
No, that's one other complex layer.
So you'd also have to have the celli at some point would be put through those as well. And it's not because of the way that the stage, normally you would have speakers down here, but because of the set design, they decided to put them in the ceiling, which again, and you end up just going, where? Oh, yeah, no, I can't hear that. There were lots and lots of rehearsals.
But it was the sound designer who said to put them up there. You know that?
Yeah.
I never would have put you through it if I'd known it was so torturous.
It was torturous. But worth it.
Yeah.
Definitely worthwhile.
As an audience member, of course, I don't see any of this technicality, but what I did hear, and I was surprised to hear it, was you moving from speaking into song and then back into speaking. And that seemed to be a very important defining material in your work. So how was that to do that? And have you done that before?
Not like this, no. But it was an interesting process, primarily because it was used as a way, it was almost used as an emotional outlet. If you're talking and then suddenly you sing, it's almost like an outburst of realism where you're actually there for the moment, but after that you can't be there again. So it was a really interesting technical usage, which, I mean, there might have been a little bit of swearing at the beginning, but we got over that. But when it all came together, it worked so beautifully, and that's what was really interesting. The pain, torture, sometimes humiliation were definitely worth it. Definitely. So I thank you.
Was this the first time that you'd worked in that way, moving from the spoken word into song?
It's not the first time I've worked that way, but it's the first time I've worked that way to this extent. Right. And actually what Gwen said is exactly the reasons why I did it. Gwen is incredibly insightful into the score. It's amazing. She always knows what I was thinking, which is joyous. But yes, so there was, I mean, it's very much written into essentially also the people that are performing the work as well. It was really important to me to have not just a range of voices in, say, the typical sense in that, we have the certain actual ranges, soprano, mezzo, etc. But also in terms of practice, it was really important to have that range of vocal practice in the piece to kind of articulate the universality of this experience, but also in terms of the way that the cellos are written for. I thought about them sometimes as essentially one instrument and sometimes as a fractured instrument and as the four individuals. And then also the various different kind of vocal productions in the piece. Like I said, there were moments where I felt like, that word is where the kind of the real emotion lies. I'm going to allow it to pop out at that point and then restrain it, and then pop out, restrain it. And all of those structural devices in the vocal writing are very much touching on the lived experience of what women go through in terms of trauma after sexual assault.
I mean, I think that that lived experience really, for me, defines this work, because what I feel, and maybe this is certainly a feminist material, it's in those spaces between, all those spaces between all of these details, that you fill the space as an audience in a maybe deeper way. You dive into those spaces between and try to make sense of those spaces between. And as such, you're very present in the lived experience of the work, moment to moment. And I found myself feeling very present in my body. And I feel the work in so many ways kind of foregrounds the female body, and certainly invited me to feel the experience of the work, the repetitions, the rhythms, the vibrations, the tremors I think, of the work felt so powerfully lived. Sorry, I've just come out of my ear. So I wonder whether or not you guys were so conscious of that as you were creating the work. Were you consciously working with the bodies of the audience in mind?
Definitely. Definitely. Well, the thing is, I just keep stressing that 60 to 70% of the rehearsals was about delivering the music. But we didn't do so much staging work, not as much as you would normally do. So it was like everything was different. So I suppose the visceral quality that you're talking about is, I think, built into the DNA of the music. And then from the production point of view, we just added a sort of our own sort of cohering psychological logic. So all 4 women knew exactly where they were at any given moment. They were sitting in the park at Telegraph Hill looking at the view, remembering having ridden or taken their stabilisers off their little pink bike when they were little. So they all had these shared pictures. And so we added very little in terms of the visceral nature of it. I think it's the sound that is really doing that. The composition is really doing that. And in some cases, the language is doing that. And then also the pressure that the music is putting vocally and physically on the singers. There were moments there. The only time where we may have done the thing that you're asking is when there were moments when time stops and rewinds. So we did some sequences like that where people go backwards and forwards, and that might be embodied. They stand up and they sit. They stand, they sit, they stand, they sit, as if one had got sort of stuck in time. But there were very few of those, weren't there? So I really think it's the sound. It's what the voice is doing. Laura's request on the voices, on the percussion, on the cellists. Don't you think? I think that's the...
Yes.
So it's nothing to do with me.
The sound, but also, you know, that kind of formal structure, as you say, of the text, and that repetition. You know, it struck me this idea of the impossibility of staging trauma.
Yeah.
And how you can almost only capture it through a kind of ghosting, a kind of resonance that comes through memory.
Yeah.
And through those repetitions that are felt in the body through your senses.
Yeah, and a sort of repetition as well, the way that it kind of repeats or like vibrates, maybe is a better way of sort of describing it, through kind of through everything. So it's kind of those sort of, and I think like Laura has really picked up on that idea. So there's bits where like sort of spoken bits of the text are kind of layered on top of the music, and it's this sort of sense of it all kind of vibrating, and I think it gives you that visceral sense of it kind of vibrating inside the body as well, like, because that's definitely my experience as well of, sorry, I'm hitting my microphone, of watching it in the audience or in the auditorium, is just the kind of the very physical, like the way it's physically inside your body. Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that idea of the vibration and that lived experience is certainly something that's going to stay with me and vibrate in my memory for a long time. So thank you all very much for this wonderful conversation. But I'm afraid that that's all we have time for this evening. So thank you very much for joining us, panel, and all of the best for your opening night. And we're just going to stay seated for a moment. So just to say that we appreciate that many of the issues discussed this evening may be distressing, and if you have been affected by the themes of sexual violence, you can seek advice. Rape Advice, Rape Crisis is an umbrella charity that supports local crisis centres across the country and helps survivors of rape, sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and any form of sexual violence. You can contact Rape Crisis via their free helpline for support or to find out what services are available in your area. So, if you are interested in continuing this vital conversation, The Blue Woman opens on the 6th of July in Limbury Theatre here at the Royal Opera House. Additionally, you can find out more about programming for this year's Engender Festival on the website. We hope that you'll join us online later this week on Friday the 8th of July at 5 p.m. for another Engender Insight, investigating the gender authority gap. This conversation, facilitated by the Independent's arts advisor Jessie Thompson and featuring esteemed writer Mary Ann Sieghart and best-selling author and journalist Ote Uagaba, looks beyond the sector to better understand the challenges and barriers that remain for women across the creative industries. Thank you all so much for being here this evening, and thank you to our panellists and to our audience here in the Claw studio, as well as those of you watching around the world. It's been wonderful to have you with us for this insight. Good night.